Now, the death toll from the Türkiye-Syria twin quakes has now surpassed 46,000. Almost 2 weeks ago, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake hit the two neighbouring nations, leaving a trail of destruction. The search, rescue and recovery mission continued, with survivors miraculously still being found under the building's rubble. Just yesterday, 3 people, including a child, were rescued at Hatay city, but the child later succumbed to dehydration. 31-year-old Ghanaian international and FC marksman Christian Atsu was found dead in the ruins of a building he lived in. Our reporter Ahmed Kajee was on the ground in Turkey, bringing us coverage as the rescue team worked tirelessly to help those trapped under the rubble. He joins us now in studio for a first-hand account. Ahmed, very good evening to you. Welcome back.
Good evening, good to be back on South African shores.
I can imagine. In fact, I can't begin to imagine what you've gone through, the experience. I mean, we saw freezing temperatures, and we saw that the devastation, the buildings looked really, really scary. What was it like for you? I mean, how are you feeling?
I think it's a mixture of a lot of feelings at the moment. Just arriving in Istanbul initially, you think, well, the damage and the devastation isn't that intense. Because you're still in the first world city, everything seems to be fine. But as we made our way from Istanbul, after 2 days of travel, understandably, the logistics to get from Istanbul to the disaster-stricken area of Hatay, that took us 2 days from the time we landed in Istanbul right through until we actually arrived. It included an 8-hour drive, which was just 250 kilometers. You think it's a 3-hour drive. But because all the relief workers, all the family members, so many people wanting to get into the Hatay area where one of the epicenters of that earthquake was, that's when you realize the devastation, that 8-hour drive in. And when we finally had reached the Hatay region, that's when you see thousands of buildings being destroyed. Absolutely damaged, razed to the ground, just concrete. 8 or 9-story buildings were down to 3 or 4 stories. Some were completely toppled onto their side. People would have set up whatever they have left on camp at the side of the road. That was it. They had absolutely nothing left. Absolutely devastating scenes coming in. It was almost one of those where you say everything's being damaged and was completely destroyed, and whatever was left still was structurally unstable. It was absolutely devastating, and that was just the first day driving in to the Hatay region. And then when we had arrived, the emergency services of Turkey, AFAD, was also trying to get their responses up in check. So when we initially had arrived to their base at the Hatay stadium, they were, in essence, trying to get their operations underway. So when we had arrived, the Gift of the Givers team, unfortunately, we slept on a bus that we had traveled in for the entire day on that first night in before finally getting the resources. But overall, as soon as we had arrived, you don't realize the devastation from TV screens and on social media videos until you actually are on the ground.
And seeing those buildings completely destroyed was just the one part. Then came the actual bodies, the people, the interaction, and the grassroots destruction and the impact it's having on the people in the country. What was that like?
When we finally managed to leave the stadium complex, the rescue teams had finally understood their operations. That's when things become very real, very quickly. Many people, you'll see buildings, you'll see bedroom. It's aspects around, seeing a bedroom suite, seeing people just, seeing toys on the floor, knowing that there's a story behind every single one of these. Many of the people, like I say, looking for tents. They had absolutely no place to stay. There was no roof over their head. Their building had collapsed, and whatever they could have had, they had kind of just, taken a sheet, taken some clothing, and made a makeshift shelter for themselves. And in essence, started their lives and hoped that they could at least find a loved one, find a husband, find a wife, find a child, find a daughter, a son. That strength coming through from those people, just hoping that the rescue workers and that will at least be able to find their families alive. And the Turkish people also being a big part of, being a Muslim country as well, a big part of them was their faith to say that, even if we don't see it, always simply, even if our family members don't survive, as long as we just get that closure to see their bodies. And even for those who managed to see their bodies, unfortunately, the person you saw prior to the earthquake, concrete, steel, all of that falling on a person, being there for 3 or 4 days, when you're finally there, that raw emotion, exceptionally difficult. But the hospitality from these people who have lost everything, whatever small bit that they have, whatever small water which they have received from emergency services, offering it to the rescue workers, to the recovery workers, to journalists, to ensure that, even though you're in my country, you're a visitor, we'd like to at least extend a welcome to you.
And you automatically became, like the people on the ground. I mean, you took in their emotions, you took in their tears, their fears, and their vulnerabilities, in terms of how you also had to camp and sleep, because you too didn't have a roof under your head as soon as you became a part of the communities.
Yes, very much so. Our camp with the Gift of the Givers rescue teams was set up at the Hatay Stadium. And when we had eventually found, the first night, you're not really sure where you're going to be staying the following night. Mm-hmm. And that's just, exactly what everyone else was experiencing, except thankfully we knew that help would come at some point in time. But, staying in a parking lot in the stadium, you think, all right, it may not be that bad, until you set up a tent in 0 degrees Celsius temperatures, at times dropping down to -5 degrees Celsius. You have 3 or 4 blankets, and that was it. The clothes that you took, whatever thermal clothing you could have taken, whatever layers you really could wear, to an extent where at some point in the evenings you're just wearing all the clothes that you've taken because it's that cold. And that was the difficulties which we have faced. And if you think about it relatively, relative to what the victims were facing, we had blankets, we had clothing on, at least we had some fire around us. We were still feeling exceptionally cold. For a person stuck under rubble for 3 or 4 days, it's -5, -10 degrees once the wind chill factor starts. You haven't eaten, you haven't drunk. It must be exceptionally difficult for them. I can't even begin to imagine what they went through. But overall, between what we experienced, it was difficult. And I think it really needs to be, one has to take the hats off to the South African Police Service, K9 units, the Gift of the Givers, the SARS of South African Rescue, the Search and Rescue of South Africa, all of those teams which came through to the fore, and not just from South Africa, across the world have come through to be first responders on scenes like that. It just,
so
we
at
really
this
need to
point,
take our hands off.
Absolutely. The work has been outstanding. So at this point, you've now awoken to the reality on the ground. You've interacted with people. You've seen bodies laying there for several days, and the destruction and the impact that it's having on the people on the ground. What are you at this stage feeling as a journalist covering the story with other journalists who are there and there to essentially tell the story, because you're also now becoming a part of it? Yes,
it's at the moment, it's just replaying all of these stories and replaying all these engagements that you have with people and wondering where they are right now. I'm going to just touch into a few of the interactions I've had with them, but it also makes you question a lot about what we as South Africans and we as people in our personal capacity, consider big problems, or what small problems we really are complaining about. Is internet access the biggest issue we have right now? Is having a toilet the biggest issue you have right now? We never had toilets or adequate sanitation for the entire week that we were there, for the entire 10 days that we were there. For many of the people, that's going to be the reality going forward. For millions of South Africans, that's their reality for decades, which we only would have experienced on the ground. We had interactions with a few people. A 15-year-old child we had spoken to, he said, his mom and dad were trying to get him out the house really quickly, and as they ran out, he was walking out behind them, and the building that they were staying in fell on top of them. He was in a pensive state almost. Another person, I think he was in complete denial. You can see he was really disturbed. Even though there was a smile on his face, you could see that the reality really hadn't set in. Another man we had interacted with, he said, he had to run out of his house without any clothes on. The soldiers had given him their clothing. And it was at the time rescue workers were trying to recover bodies out. And they had taken out 3 bodies in front of him. It was a mother, the father, and a child. And at the time it was a 3-year-old child. And he said that child is a Syrian child, so she was already displaced from the Syrian war. And that child would wave to him every morning before he used to go to work. It's stories like that, that are really emotional, that really hit home. And just finally, also just to give insight into what the collapses look like, is many of the buildings are 5, 6, or 7 stories high. And we have a thing called a pancake collapse, and that's when each floor collapses in on itself. And one of the people who was waiting for his brother to be recovered, he accepted that he wasn't going to be rescued. And he just said, my brother's 43 years old. I've accepted that I'm not going to see him again. All I just want is his body so I can give him a burial, get closure. But I'm fine knowing that I'll see him in heaven. But, those pancake collapses were devastating but gave hope, because at least there's generally the idea that maybe you can get someone who's stuck between 2 pieces of concrete. But overall, exceptionally devastating.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ahmed. Thanks for talking to us and telling us about these experiences on the ground. I mean, you yourself did exceptionally well under the circumstances, and what you had to see, I can only imagine how much you will yourself need to undergo a lot of introspection and therapy to recover from that devastation. I mean, you had to wear many, many hats. So, I'm wishing you, too, the very best. My colleague Ahmed Kajee there talking to us about the devastation that he had to witness, the interactions he had with the people of Turkey in the wake of those earthquakes that have now left more than 46,000 people dead.